Welcome to CivilNet. I have three distinguished scholars representing three different disciplines here in the studio with us. They recently presented their papers at the American University of Armenia. Now I'd like to welcome each of them. Hourig Attarian, first of all, welcome to Yerevan and to CivilNet. You are an assistant professor at the Department of Education at Concordia University and a core member of the Center for Oral History and Digital Storytelling, also at Concordia.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
Lerna Ekmekcioglu, you are Associate Professor of History and Women and Gender Studies at MIT. And Melissa Bilal, a postdoctoral teaching fellow at Columbia University at the Music Department. So indeed, we have three different disciplines here, education, history, and music. And the title of your speech or your papers yesterday at the American University was Written on Women's Bodies, Interdisciplinary Perspectives on Gender and Genocide. So three different disciplines talking about how women were impacted, affected by the genocide and the genocide policy 100 years ago, and it is the centenary year of the Armenian genocide. So Hourig, I'd like to start with you, if I may. You know, oftentimes as women, Armenian women, we tend not to talk about many of the issues that impact us as women, and particularly sexual violence that took place during the genocide. How important is it, was it, continues to be for you to talk about these issues? Because the focus of your speech yesterday was the stories, the intergenerational stories and how they impacted us. Talk to me, if you will, a bit about that.
Thank you, Maria. Very good question. But before I talk, I just want to say it's such an honor and privilege being here in CivilNet after watching you so much on live TV. Intergenerational storytelling is a very, very important aspect of understanding and negotiating identity and also memory. And there has been quite a bit in terms of collecting oral histories of survivors. But very interestingly, what has been, I mean, it's one of the emergent issues in the last decade, talking about more women's experiences of genocide and atrocities and mass violence, and specifically talking from the perspective of women. It's not that there may have been stories that have been told about women's experiences, but they have not been told through the women's perspectives. One of the interests that I've had in my work, for example, is not only looking at the stories of the women, but also even within the intergenerational transmission of those stories, looking at how these stories are passed on from grandmothers or great aunts to their daughters, to their granddaughters and great granddaughters. And that kind of matrilineal line, if you will, of the storytelling is very, very interesting as well in terms of understanding these memories, in terms of understanding the impact of these experiences as well. That is something that I would really kind of like to stress. And specifically, again, in terms of the sexual violence of the stories, a lot of these stories, when they have been told, there are certain euphemisms or tropes or certain kind of language that also is used or has been used by women who have undergone these experiences. So also delving into these aspects of the storytelling and trying to understand the language in which they are told is also something that is very, very important.
And talking about memory, Melissa, I'd like to talk to you now. When I read what you were presenting, it was very interesting to me about the lullabies that grandmothers or mothers sang to their children. How important is the role of memory from your studies in using music?
Yes. So my work focuses on the Armenians who stayed in Turkey after the genocide, after the formation of the Turkish Republic, especially those who stayed outside Istanbul. And I was also in Istanbul. I was interested in understanding how the first generation of survivors transmitted their stories of survival and death of their loved ones to the new generation or to each other. And I came to realize that songs that the survivor generation created during the marches, during the genocide, and in the immediate aftermath of the genocide played an important role in this transmission, especially within the context of the suppressive political environment, atmosphere in Turkey in the immediate aftermath of the genocide and the early decades of the Republic. So songs were very central in this transmission. When it comes to lullabies, I think lullaby plays an important role. It does an important work in terms of transmitting these memories. Not only the words, the content of the lullaby, but because lullabies are considered, I was told many times by the people that I interviewed with, the people that I shared, I had conversations with, told me that lullabies are precious family traditions. So we all know that the post-genocide Armenian family was a place where sound and silence worked together to create meaning, making sense of the past, what happened, and silence was obviously a part of understanding what happened in the recent past and how to deal with it, especially in the context of denial of the Turkish Republic. So lullaby, and my definition of lullaby is not very static or very conventional. My definition of lullaby is a song that creates a context of bodily exchange, sensual exchange, that exchange of voice and stories within the very specific context of post-genocide Armenian household, where grandmothers or mothers or great aunts, as Hourig said, became this these bodies, these kind of pillars of an information, a knowledge, a history that is gradually will be taken away from the coming generations. So then the grandmother's lullaby or the great aunt's lullaby becomes this material sonic connection between the younger generations and the generation of the survivors.
Have those lullabies survived until today? Are there lullabies that we might hear but not realize that they were created, formed, sang 100 years ago as a result of the genocide?
I mean, there are lullabies that are transmitted onto the next generations within the family. Some of the lullabies that I recorded were only known to that particular family. But there are also lullabies, and there are lullabies that were remembered, kind of brought along from the place during the migration from, because right after the genocide, Armenians lived in their hometowns, those who survived and could come back or were hiding. When they had to migrate to Istanbul gradually during the later decades, they brought songs from their town or from a song that was created by another woman, their neighbor, maybe their friend. So sometimes one lullaby is known to women from different families because they heard from each other. Sometimes one lullaby is known to different women because they were connected by marriage, things like that.
Or from the same village or town as well.
From the same village. Or, but of course lullaby singing is most of the times a very private,
very intimate, and it's almost always the women, right, who are singing the lullabies.
I mean, of course, I as a feminist, I cannot argue that women are only ones who sing the
traditionally,
lullabies.
I mean, when we talk about
yeah, there are
ago.
also men who remember their mothers or grandmothers or great aunts' lullabies. They sing them to their children, but I think we can it's fair to say that lullabies were songs created by women, especially when we think of the post-genocide Armenian household context where women were getting together and sharing stories about survival and death of their loved ones to each other. So the importance of memory, you just asked, we were discussing about this yesterday actually, because there is this kind of perception or there's this idea that there is no written testimonies right after the genocide, or the coming decades after the genocide. But I argue that if we have to look at the songs that women created or men created all those decades, because they are testimonial songs and they are testimonies of what happened, and they are precious because they are the immediate link that we have to their experiences, and they are diverse. And lullabies are important, and other songs that women created are important because they also transmit what happened, transmit their experiences from their own worldview, from their own perspective and their experience. Sure. Exactly, and it makes it very particular and specific, talking about the whole experience of Armenians and the genocide, but at the same time talking about one particular woman's experience or one particular family's experience. So that's why it's very rich.
Yeah, thank you. That's it. We don't often talk about the lullabies that women or men transmitted to their own children as a result of the genocide. Lerna, you are a historian. Your focus was on the genocide and its immediate aftermath in Istanbul. I want to return, if we may, to talk about those women who experienced sexual violence during the genocide and how they were then received once they were back within the community. How did the patriarchy, if we may call it that, accept them back in, and those challenges that they had to face perhaps as well?
Yes, immediately after the war, after the armistice, after the signing of the armistice in October 1918, the Armenian patriarch, once he returned to his seat, he had also been exiled during the genocide. Once he returns, one of the first things that he initiates is to organize a rescue effort, what we might call a rescue effort. In Armenia, it's Vorpahavak. The goal of the Vorpahavak is to liberate Azadakrel Armenians, mostly women and young children of both sexes, from inside Muslim institutions. That is, Muslim, Kurdish, Armenian, Turkish, mostly households and orphanages. Because they do know that during the war years, significant numbers of Armenians were transferred to the community of the perpetrator, the Muslims. So my work revolves around this question of who is going to decide whom to rescue and who is going to decide who is an Armenian, because only the Armenians are going to be rescued. What I found out, despite, I guess, against my own expectations, I figured that the patriarchate, the administrative decision-making bodies of the nation in Constantinople at this point decide that everyone with an Armenian mother, every Armenian woman, formerly Armenian, now forcibly Islamized, living in a Muslim context, is an Armenian, and their children is also an Armenian.
Regardless of the
regardless of the father's identity and regardless of how the child was conceived. which is interesting. Both it's interesting because it's interesting. We are Armenians, and we do this, but also theoretically very interesting. This is a very actually important contribution to the field of genocide studies, gender studies, because temporarily, even though they are Armenians as a Christian group, a patrilineal society, and it's the same with the Islamic community as well, because Christianity and Islam share this what we call monogenetic mentality. It's the fathers who pass identity to their children. At this point, in the aftermath of this crisis, big crisis, they create new technologies to a certain extent, and they relax that rule. So they're also matrilineal at this point. They will accept any child who is born to an Armenian woman, a full-fledged Armenian, and the orphanages will accept them in Istanbul and around Istanbul, and the Armenian church will baptize them. Because they know that, they know, or they think, they argue that it wasn't the, it is not, the women themselves should not be accused
held responsible
of, and held responsible of what the,
what was done to them.
What was done to them, or they would, in the press, in the primary sources that I read, many times they would think that this is the barbarian races doing this to our women.
So
I mean,
the
there
women
are
weren't
political
ostracized?
reasons.
The women weren't ostracized then?
My work shows that the political elite, the decision-making people, the elite of various different backgrounds, this is across the board in Istanbul at least. What I saw in that all the Armenian political parties, including, not in addition to that, people who are closer to the church, people who are feminists, because there's a vibrant Armenian cultural and political life in Istanbul from 1918 to late 22. It also continues, but in different shape later on. So, irrespective of their political standpoints, they all agree that these women should not be stigmatized.
It's fascinating.
People might have stigmatized them on the ground.
Right. In their community
they wouldn't
or family.
Get them as brides, for instance. The native Istanbul community doesn't seem to love these miserable refugees who found their way or rescued by men, and now they're in Istanbul. Many of them live in these what we call gayans, refugee stations, basically in Istanbul. But there seems to be enough concern about them that they find them, they shelter them, they feed them, they clothe them, and then they cure them. They have a lot of diseases, and then they try to marry them off to proper Armenian men.
Proper Armenian men.
But they are trying to undo what happened to them.
You know, this discussion can veer off into another direction. My inclination is to ask you then, when those rules or that genetic coding or that were relaxed in that time of crisis, then did that shift? Did we revert back to a conservative, patrilineal? But I don't know if we want to get into.
No, it's a good question, and this is automatically how people respond to it, because we think that being this inclusive is a progressive thing, which is the opposite of which being conservative. But my research also showed that it's not necessarily a progressive thing, because the women, not every woman wants to be rescued. That's one thing, for various reasons. Some of them want to stay in their new Muslim households for various reasons. Again, and the second one, some of them don't want to give birth to children that they did not want in the first place. So they might consider them as the children of the enemy. We see there are special maternity wards for pregnant, rescued women. Some of them don't want to be there. They don't want to give birth, but the patriarchate's policy is to make sure that they give birth to their children. So to a certain extent, the women are now victimized the second time around.
Again.
Yeah, so it's not necessarily progressive, but it does go back to patrilinearity because of political and legal reasons. Because the Turkish Republic happens. It's not like,
Sure.
So
we can carry this conversation on for hours, I suspect. Hourig, I just want to wrap up what we've been talking about. This giving a sort of looking through history with a gender lens, in particular the genocide. in particular in the centenary year, and the phenomenal work that all three of you and others are doing in this field. Does it give a new perspective of the genocide study, of our own collective national identity? Is it liberating us? Is it further oppressing us? Is it opening sort of a pathway to a new understanding of ourselves?
Well, certainly this is something that we actually touched upon quite a bit, apart from our separate papers talking about this. But at the very beginning in the introduction, we talked about how gender matters and why it is important. It's something that affects us in our present, in the way we live our lives, and it has also affected us in the past. And so there are certain things that we can see through a gendered lens of analysis that we wouldn't be able to see otherwise. I'm not sure whether it liberates or oppresses further, but it certainly opens up a very, very important analytical lens that has not been there. And it makes us more aware of the voices, and not only of the voices, but most of all the silences. And understanding this is something what Melissa talks about, what Lerna talks about, and what I talk about in very different ways in our work, that we often look at silence as an absence of a story or an absence of a narration, yet it is not so. And silence is actually a part of that narration and a part of that narrative. So how do we try to get to that silence is something that is very important and very, very crucial. And also if there is one other thing that I would like to add in the importance of a gendered lens is also in terms of different methodological approaches, what this means. Maybe this is something that, if you have time for it, that each of us could elaborate a little bit more about, because it's a very, very central issue in terms of how you also approach these analyses. For example, in my work, what I try to do is to infuse not only a narrative inquiry, but also an art-based approach in looking at these issues. So using a visual language, using research creation as a methodology, as an approach to look at these stories, to infuse a visual aspect into the textual and academic aspect of it, which is no less rigorous. And so this is something that is very important that I also would like to stress. For example, using research creation, now you can use, within an ethnographic approach of exhibition, of dealing with difficult memories, it is important to also look at how you can use installations, photo collages, soundscapes, memoryscapes, which add a different depth of wealth and richness to the data itself, to the stories itself, and they also make it more accessible. They make this material, both the archival material and the analytical material, more accessible to people, to a more general public as well. So this is a very, very important aspect that goes with it as well.
Sure. Well, if you'd like to, briefly talk about what Hourig was saying, yeah.
Going back to the previous question, when you asked if there are still songs that are being sung within the community, I have to also add to that there is a tremendous amount of forgetting as well, or suppressing memory as well. So there are songs that are transmitted and there are songs that are not transmitted, or there are families whose, like in my family, there is no absolute silence and there is no absolute speech and telling. So I think I am more interested in understanding what connects the present to the past, and what connects us to the memory of the genocide. And in my case, because I'm working on the present and somebody who was born and raised in Turkey, I'm interested in how the effects of the genocide is still continuing in Turkey today. Actually, this is a common kind of slogan, common motto nowadays by a group called the Norzartonk in Istanbul. They say genocide is going on. I think it is very symbolic that people feel like the genocide is going on, because past is connected to the present, and our present subjectivities, the way our citizenship is governed in Turkey, is very much connected to the denial and what happened. Not only the denial, the genocide itself, but at the same time, the ongoing, process of, robbing us of our citizenship rights. And but when I look at these songs and stories that are being transmitted and not transmitted, it gives me a chance to understand both the continuity and the rupture. Because so far, I mean, what is the importance of looking at these songs or these stories, memory, is not only on, for example, when I just said that these are testimonies, blah, blah, but I didn't mean that we have to deal with them as proofs of history or testimonies. I mean, oral historical research never works like that. And we have other researchers such as Virginia Svazlian, whose work is great in terms of documenting this oral accounts from the genocide survivors. But my work is very much of an answer to your question, like what is the relationship we have with the genocide and these survivor stories. We talked about the genocide, but I'm also interested in the decades following the genocide, how Armenians survived in their homelands or in Istanbul, and how they narrated their own life stories and their experiences, not only of genocide, but surviving in Turkey in the later decades as well, and how they make sense of that experience today when they tell it to me. So in that sense, I think all the emotions that they transmit to me, all the emotions that they transmit to their children, is where we have to look to understand the relationship between today and the past, the present, and the genocide memory. That's why working on memory gives me that critical lens to actually talk about larger political issues about the genocide recognition and these kind of, because all through the year of 2015, I came to realize that we talk about genocide recognition, we talk about the genocide, but we often fail to talk about the survivors themselves who are still alive, or the descendants of the survivors and how they managed to survive.
And we don't even oftentimes give them a name. You know, it was interesting on April 24th and that whole month, actually, people, using social media were saying, today I remember my grandparents, I remember my great aunt, I remember my and we never gave them a name. It was they've become faceless, nameless. So we talk about them in the larger context of survivor only, and yet they were human beings with families and lives. Lerna, I'm going to end with you, and perhaps I'm going to ask you an unfair question, but since I'm the anchor here, I get to do that. As an academic, as a scholar, 2015, 100 years, you're a historian, you look back, you study. What about the future? What about the future?
In terms of what?
I'm not going to ask you that grand question, where's the Armenian nation going? And how do we break the cycle? You have 2 daughters. I have children, I have grandson. We seem to, the memories keep passing on. And what is it that we want for them? How do we break that cycle, and how do we move forward as individuals, as individual Armenians, human beings, with this sort of thing of genocide hanging over us?
I don't think it is up to us to break the cycle. I don't think it's the survivors or their descendants who is going to break the cycle. As long as the denial looms large in our lives, we don't have any other option but to pass those stories to the next generation. It is their destiny. It's a historical thing that happened to us, and we don't have any control over it. at this point. We are its victims to a certain extent. We do what we do with it, but in my life I chose to pass it on, and I think it's the politically right thing to do. One day, if it's recognized and if it's repaired, but however much it can be repaired, then we might think of breaking the cycle.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for this very invigorating conversation. Thank you for the amazing work that you're doing in the area of gender and genocide and history. And thank you for coming to CivilNet out of your busy schedules.
Thank you.
I'd like to remind our viewers that my guests here today in the studio were three distinguished scholars from different disciplines: Hourig Attarian, Melissa Bilal, and Lerna Ekmekcioglu. Keep following CivilNet.